The radio had been silent for 17 minutes. 17 minutes since the last transmission came through from Viper 2-1, call sign belonging to Captain Jonah Reyes, whose F-16 had taken a surface-to-air missile through the left stabilizer somewhere over the Carson Valley. 17 minutes since he'd ejected over hostile terrain, his parachute drifting into a canyon system, so remote that even the satellites had trouble holding a clear image through the dust and thermals. The combat search and rescue birds were still 40 minutes out, tangled up in a sandstorm that had rolled in from the northwest like a curtain closing on a stage. The task force commander had already started drafting the recovery timeline in his head, calculating windows and risk margins, when the emergency beacon flared back to life. Short bursts, deliberate intervals. Someone was alive down there and someone was close. The operations center at Bagram went taut. Screens flickered with topographical overlays. The valley Reyes had gone down in was a kill box, a natural choke point lined with ridges and overwatch positions. Intelligence had flagged it weeks ago as a high-movement area for insurgent cells equipped with Chinese MANPADS and Iranian rockets. Going in without air superiority was suicide. Going in without close air support was worse. The nearest Apache gunship was refueling. The nearest jet was 20 minutes out and low on ordnance. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was counting down to something irreversible. Then a voice came through the channel, calm and measured, with the kind of tone that didn't ask for permission. Bagram Actual, this is Hog 23. I'm 15 miles west of the valley. I can be overhead in 4 minutes. There was a pause, not hesitation, calculation. The officer in command leaned forward, his eyes on the call sign roster. Hog 23, Thunderbolt, close air support platform, and the pilot's name made a few heads turn. Captain Marin Cade. The name carried weight, but not the kind that inspired confidence in a room full of men used to operating on reflex and reputation. Cade had been in theater for 6 weeks. She was a reservist brought in to fill gaps after a squadron rotation went sideways. She flew the Warthog, a plane some of the younger pilots considered outdated, a relic from a different kind of war. Her file was clean, her hours were solid, but she wasn't part of the inner circle. She didn't drink with the fast jet guys. She didn't showboat in the debrief room. She just flew her missions, logged her reports, and disappeared. The commander's jaw tightened. He glanced at the screen showing Reyes' beacon, then at the storm front swallowing the horizon. Hog 23 Bagram, what's your fuel state? 3,200 pounds. Enough. Enough for what? Enough to get him out. The line went quiet. Then the commander made the call. Marin Cade had been airborne for 90 minutes when the alert came through. She'd been flying a routine patrol along the northern corridor, watching the mountains roll past her canopy in shades of gray and gold, her hands light on the stick, her mind split between the instruments and the terrain below. The A-10 wasn't fast. It wasn't sleek. But it was hers, and she knew every rivet and hydraulic line in the airframe like she knew the scars on her own hands. When the emergency frequency crackled to life, her eyes went to the coordinates before the voice even finished speaking. Carson Valley. She knew it. Everyone knew it. It was a graveyard with mountains on 3 sides and no easy exit. The kind of place where helicopters got shredded and fast movers couldn't hang around long enough to matter. But the A-10 wasn't a fast mover. She banked south without waiting for clearance, her thumb already keying the radio. Bagram Actual, Hog 23. I'm 15 miles west of the valley. I can be overhead in 4 minutes. The response came slower than she expected, and she could hear the doubt bleeding through the static. They asked about her fuel. She told them the truth. It was enough. Barely. But in this kind of fight, barely was all anyone ever had. She didn't wait for them to argue. She nosed the Warthog down, letting gravity pull her toward the valley, her eyes scanning the horizon for smoke, for movement, for anything that would tell her where Reyes had gone down. The heads-up display painted the world in clean lines and numbers, but Marin had learned long ago not to trust the screen more than her instincts. She'd flown in places where the instruments lied and the terrain killed faster than the enemy. The valley opened up beneath her like a wound in the earth, steep walls rising on either side, the floor choked with boulders and dry riverbeds that looked like veins from altitude. She could see dust trails, faint and recent, cutting through the northern ridge. Movement. That was never good. Her radio crackled again. Hog 2-3, Viper 2-1. If you're up there, I could really use a friend right now. Ray's, his voice was tight, controlled, but there was an edge underneath it. Pain or fear, maybe both. Marin's hand moved to the throttle, coaxing a little more speed out of the Warthog's twin turbofans. Viper 2-1, Hog 2-3. I've got you, what's your status? Busted ankle, took some shrapnel in the leg, I'm mobile but not fast. I can see movement on the ridgeline maybe half a click north. They're spreading out. Marin's eyes flicked to her tactical display. No friendly forces within 20 miles. No air support except her. She ran the math in her head. Fuel, ordnance, time. None of it added up to easy. Copy that, Viper. I'm coming in low. Stay put and keep your head down. She pushed the stick forward, dropping altitude until the canyon walls rose up around her like the sides of a grave. The first pass was reconnaissance. Marin kept the Warthog low, maybe 300 feet off the deck, her eyes moving between the canopy glass and the instruments, reading the ground the way a river guide reads water. She saw Ray's almost immediately, a dark shape crouched behind a cluster of rocks near the base of the southern ridge, his parachute bundled and half buried in the dirt. Smart. He wasn't making it easy for them. She also saw the trucks. 3 of them, Soviet-era pickups with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds, crawling along a ridgeline trail that would put them within firing range in less than 5 minutes. Behind them, scattered among the rocks, she counted at least a dozen dismounts moving in a loose skirmish line. They knew where Ray's was. They were just taking their time. Marin's jaw tightened. She pulled the Warthog into a climbing turn, gaining altitude, her mind already working through the attack sequence. She had 6 Maverick missiles, a full load of 30mm rounds in the A-10 cannon, and a pair of rocket pods she'd almost forgotten were even mounted. Enough to make a mess, not enough to stay long. She keyed the radio. Viper 2-1, Hog 2-3. I've got 3 technicals on the North Ridge and multiple dismounts moving toward your position. I'm going to make some noise. When I do, you move south. There's a draw about 200 meters behind you. Get there and stay low. Copy, Hog. How bad is it? Marin didn't answer right away. She was lining up her first run, her thumb hovering over the weapons selector. Bad enough, but I didn't fly all the way out here to watch you get captured. There was a pause, then a faint laugh over the radio, strained but genuine. Glad you're here. Marin rolled the Warthog inverted, pulling the nose down toward the ridgeline, her eyes locked on the lead truck. Don't thank me yet. The first Maverick missile left the rail with a sharp clunk, the motor igniting a half-second later, the weapon streaking toward the ridgeline in a plume of white smoke. Marin didn't watch it hit. She was already rolling out, pulling hard to avoid the terrain, her eyes tracking the other 2 trucks as they scattered. The explosion lit up her peripheral vision, a bright orange flash followed by a column of black smoke that boiled up from where the lead vehicle had been. The shockwave rolled across the valley floor, scattering dust and debris. She came around again, lower this time, the Warthog's nose pointed at the second truck. The gunner was already swinging the mounted machine gun toward her, muzzle flashes sparking in the dim light. She ignored it. The A-10's armor could take small arms fire. She'd been hit before. She'd been hit worse. The GAU-8 cannon spun up with a sound like the universe tearing, a deep mechanical roar that vibrated through the airframe. The 30mm rounds walked across the ridge in a line of explosions, each one throwing up dirt and rock and metal. The second truck disintegrated, the machine gun flying off the mount in 2 pieces, the chassis folding in on itself like a crushed can. Marin pulled up, rolling left, her eyes scanning for the third truck. It had veered off the trail, heading downslope toward Ray's. The driver knew what he was doing. He was trying to close the distance, trying to get below her engagement angle. She didn't let him. She brought the warthog around in a turn so tight her vision grayed at the edges, the G-forces pressing her into the seat. She leveled out, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared again, the rounds chewing through the hillside, walking toward the truck, then through it. The vehicle shuddered, rolled, and flipped, coming to rest in a smoking heap. Marin climbed again, gaining altitude, her eyes moving to the fuel gauge. She'd burned more than she wanted to on that pass. The math was starting to look grim. Viper 2-1 Hog 2-3, you mobile. Moving now, I see the draw, 30 seconds. Make it 20, they're regrouping. She wasn't wrong. The dismounts had scattered when the trucks went up, but they weren't running. They were infantry, and infantry didn't quit just because the air was hostile. They were already repositioning, moving behind cover, trying to flank Ray's new position. Marin counted at least 8 still moving, maybe more in the rocks. She rolled in again, this time with rockets. The pods rippled, launching in pairs, the missiles streaking toward the hillside in a spread pattern. The explosions were smaller than the Mavericks, but they were close enough. Rock and shrapnel rained down on the dismounts, and Marin saw at least 2 go still. The rest went to ground. She climbed again, her breath coming fast now, her hands steady on the stick. The warthog shuddered as it hit a thermal, the wings rocking slightly, but she compensated without thinking. Muscle memory. Instinct. The radio crackled. Hog 2-3 Bagram actual. CSAR is still 30 minutes out. Can you hold? Marin glanced at the fuel gauge again. She was down to 2,200 pounds. In a perfect world, she'd need at least 1,800 to make it back to base. But the world wasn't perfect, and Ray's didn't have 30 minutes. I can hold. She didn't tell them how. She didn't need to. She rolled in again. The next 10 minutes were a blur of fire and maneuver. Marin worked the valley like a surgeon, carving apart the insurgent positions with precision strikes and strafing runs, each pass a calculated risk, each pull-up a gamble against physics and fuel burn. The warthog groaned under the strain, the airframe shaking as she pushed it through turns that would have ripped the wings off a lesser plane. But the A-10 had been built for this. It had been built to take punishment and keep flying, to stay low and slow and ugly, to be the last thing standing between the enemy and the men on the ground. And Marin had been built for this too. She'd learned to fly in a place where mistakes were measured in lives, where the margin between success and failure was the width of a wingspan. She'd flown in sandstorms and under fire, through nights so dark she couldn't see the ground until she was almost on it. She'd brought planes home with holes in the fuselage and hydraulics leaking like open wounds. She knew what it felt like to be scared, to be exhausted, to wonder if the next pull of the stick would be the one that didn't respond. But she also knew what it felt like to be the only thing standing between a man and his death. And that was worth more than fuel. She came around again, lower this time, the canyon walls rising up on either side of her like teeth. The dismounts were still there, still moving, but they were slower now, more cautious. They'd learned that the sky wasn't safe. She lined up on a cluster of them near the northern ridge and opened up with the cannon, the rounds tearing through rock and flesh with equal indifference. Then her warning light flashed. Fuel low. She pulled up, climbing hard, her eyes on the gauge. 1,600 pounds. That was below minimum. That was emergency territory. She should have been climbing for altitude, heading back to base, calling for someone else to take over. But there was no one else. Viper 2-1 Hog 2-3, how are you doing down there? Ray's voice came back tight and breathless. I'm in the draw. There's still movement on the ridge. At least 4, maybe 5. They're trying to flank me from the east. Marin banked toward the eastern ridge, her eyes scanning the terrain. She saw them. 4 figures moving through the rocks, weapons slung, heads down. They thought they had time. They were wrong. She rolled in one more time. The gun run was textbook. Marin lined up the shot, adjusted for wind and angle, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared and the hillside erupted. The figures disappeared in the dust and debris. When it cleared, nothing was moving. She pulled up again, her hands trembling slightly now, the adrenaline starting to wear off. The Warthog groaned, the engines running rough, the fuel gauge dropping below 1,400 pounds. Bagram Actual Hog 2-3. I've cleared the immediate area around Viper 2-1. CSAR needs to move now. There was a pause, then the controller's voice came back, calmer now. Copy Hog. CSAR is inbound, ETA 12 minutes. What's your fuel state? Marin didn't answer right away. She was doing the math again, running the numbers, trying to figure out how to make 1,400 pounds stretch across 60 miles of hostile airspace. I'm good, she lied. Hog 2-3, say again your fuel state. She exhaled slowly, her eyes on the horizon. 1,300 pounds, I'll make it. The silence on the other end told her they didn't believe her. She wasn't sure she believed it either. But she stayed. The CSAR helicopters came in low and fast, a pair of Pave Hawks with door gunners scanning the ridgelines, their rotors beating the air into submission. Marin orbited overhead, her eyes moving between the valley floor and her instruments, watching the fuel gauge tick down with every passing second. 1,200 pounds. 1,100. The Warthog was drinking fuel faster now, the engine struggling to maintain altitude in the thin mountain air. She watched as the lead helicopter flared into a hover, the crew chief leaning out to guide Rays aboard. The captain moved fast despite his injuries, dragging himself into the cabin with the help of the gunner. The whole operation took less than 90 seconds, a choreographed chaos that looked easy from above but was anything but. Then the helicopters lifted off, banking south, accelerating toward friendly territory. The radio crackled. Hog 2-3, Viper 2-1, I'm aboard, you saved my life. Marin didn't answer right away. She was already turning north, pointing the Warthog toward home, her eyes on the fuel gauge. 1,000 pounds. That was below critical. That was into the margins where engines started flaming out and pilots started making decisions about where to put the plane down. Glad you're safe, Viper. Now let me get this thing home. She climbed as high as the Warthog could manage, trading speed for altitude, gliding more than flying now, every mile a negotiation between momentum and gravity. The desert scrolled past beneath her, endless and indifferent. The radio stayed quiet. There was nothing left to say. She almost made it. 40 miles from Bagram, the left engine coughed. The RPM dropped, the temperature spiked, and the Warthog yawed hard to the right. Marin compensated, her hands moving on instinct, adjusting the rudder, trimming the aircraft, coaxing it to stay level. The right engine was still running, still giving her thrust, but it was working overtime now, burning fuel faster than ever. The fuel gauge read 400 pounds. She keyed the radio, her voice calm despite the alarm screaming in her headset. Bagram Actual Hog 2-3. I've lost my left engine, fuel critical, request priority landing. The response was immediate. Hog 2-3 Bagram, you're cleared direct. Crash crews are standing by. Can you make the field? Marin looked at the distance readout, 38 miles. She looked at the fuel gauge, 300 pounds. She ran the numbers in her head. The math didn't work, not even close. But she'd done impossible things before. I'll make it. She nosed the Warthog down, trading altitude for distance, gliding more than flying now, the single engine whining as it fought to keep the plane aloft. The ground rose up to meet her, the base perimeter visible now, the runway a thin line of asphalt cutting through the desert. 200 pounds. 15 miles. The Warthog was shaking now, the controls sluggish, the aircraft barely responding. Marin's hands were white-knuckled on the stick, her eyes locked on the runway, her mind focused on nothing but getting the plane down. 100 pounds. 10 miles. The right engine coughed. She held her breath. The runway appeared through the haze like a mirage, shimmering and distant, and for a moment Marin wasn't sure if it was real or just her mind inventing salvation where none existed. But the numbers on her display were solid, the distance ticking down with every second, and the tower's voice in her headset was clear and urgent. Hog 23 Bagram Tower, you're cleared to land any runway. Crash crews are in position. Marin didn't respond. She didn't have the breath to spare. The Warthog was barely holding together now, the single engine screaming, the fuel gauge reading empty, the low fuel warning tone a constant shriek in her ears. She could feel the plane shuddering beneath her, the controls mushy and unresponsive, the nose wanting to drop despite her best efforts to hold it level. 5 miles. She lowered the landing gear. The hydraulics groaned, the wheels locking into place with a thud she felt through the seat. The added drag was immediate, the Warthog's glide ratio collapsing, the ground rising up faster now. 3 miles. The right engine coughed again, sputtered and died. Silence. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the alarms had been. Marin felt the plane drop, the nose pitching forward, the stick going loose in her hands. She was gliding now, truly gliding, with no thrust and no options and nothing between her and the ground but momentum and prayer. 2 miles. She could see the runway clearly now, the markings sharp and precise, the crash trucks racing along the taxiway, their lights flashing. She adjusted her angle, aiming for the threshold, her hands steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. 1 mile. The Warthog was dropping fast, too fast, the ground rushing up to meet her. She pulled back on the stick, trying to flare, trying to bleed off speed, but the aircraft was a brick now, a 30,000-pound glider with all the grace of a falling stone. The wheels hit the runway hard, the impact jolting through the airframe, the tires screaming. Marin stood on the brakes, the Warthog shuddering as it decelerated, the nose wanting to pitch forward, the tail wanting to swing around. She fought it, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals, her hands locked on the stick. The plane slowed, rolled, stopped. For a moment Marin just sat there, her hands still gripping the controls, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then the crash crews were there, surrounding the aircraft, their voices muffled through the canopy. She popped the seal, shoved the canopy back and climbed out. Her legs were shaking, but she stayed upright. On the tarmac below, the ground crew stared up at her like she'd just landed a spacecraft. One of them finally spoke. "Ma'am, you just dead-sticked an A-10 onto the runway with zero fuel. That's not supposed to be possible." Marin pulled off her helmet, her hair plastered to her scalp with sweat. She looked at the Warthog, at the scorch marks on the engine nacelle, at the fuel dripping from the empty tanks. "Tell that to the plane," she said. The debrief room was packed. Marin sat at the center of a long table, her flight suit still damp with sweat, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Across from her sat the task force commander, a full colonel with a lined face and eyes that had seen more than their share of close calls. Beside him were 2 intelligence officers, a flight surgeon, and the operations officer who'd been on duty when the call came in. They walked through the mission step by step, the intercept, the valley, the gun runs, the fuel state, the dead stick landing. Marin answered every question with the same measured calm she'd used on the radio, her voice steady, her details precise. When they asked why she hadn't turned back when her fuel went critical, she didn't hesitate. Because Captain Reyes didn't have 30 minutes, he had maybe 10, and no one else was close enough to matter. The colonel leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "You put yourself at significant risk, Captain. You could have ejected. You could have put that plane down in the desert." Marin met his eyes. I could have, but I didn't. The room went quiet. The colonel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You did good work out there, Captain. Damn good work. He stood, and the rest of the room stood with him. Dismissed. Marin walked out into the late afternoon heat, the sun already dipping toward the horizon, the base buzzing with the familiar sounds of engines and voices and life. She didn't head to her quarters. She didn't head to the mess. She walked to the flight line, where the Warthog sat in its revetment, surrounded by maintenance crews swarming over the airframe like ants. One of them saw her coming and waved. Captain Cade, this bird's a damn miracle. We found bullet holes in the tail section we didn't even know were there. And the fuel system. Hell, I don't know how you coaxed even a drop out of those tanks. Marin stepped closer, running her hand along the scarred fuselage. Because she's tougher than she looks. The crew chief grinned. So are you, ma'am. Word spread fast. By the next morning, every pilot in the squadron knew what had happened in the Carson Valley. They knew about the gun runs, the fuel state, the dead stick landing. They knew Marin Cade's name now, not as the quiet reservist who kept to herself, but as the pilot who'd pulled off the impossible and brought everyone home. Jonah Reyes found her in the briefing room 2 days later. His leg was in a brace, his face bruised, but he was walking. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, then crossed the room and held out his hand. I owe you my life. Marin shook his hand, her grip firm. You don't owe me anything, that's the job. Reyes shook his head. No, that was more than the job, that was something else. He paused, then pulled something from his pocket, a patch, his squadron patch. He held it out to her. I want you to have this, so you remember that you're part of this team, whether you drink with us or not. Marin looked at the patch, then at Reyes. She took it, turning it over in her hands. Thank you. Reyes smiled, nodded, and left. Marin stood there for a long moment, staring at the patch, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was just fabric and thread, a symbol that didn't change anything tangible, but it felt like acceptance, like recognition, like belonging. She pinned it to her flight suit, right below her wings. The missions continued. Marin flew patrol routes, close air support sorties, interdiction runs. She flew through dust storms and over mountains, through nights so dark she couldn't see the stars. The Warthog became an extension of her, the controls familiar under her hands, the roar of the cannon a sound she knew better than her own voice. But something had shifted. When she walked through the ready room now, pilots nodded. When she sat down in the briefing, people listened. When she keyed the radio, controllers answered without hesitation. She was no longer the quiet reservist in the corner. She was Hog 2-3. She was the pilot who'd held the valley, the one who'd brought Reyes home, the one who'd landed a 30,000-pound aircraft with no engines and no fuel and nothing but skill and nerve. And slowly, carefully, she let herself believe it. 3 weeks after the valley, Marin was called into the squadron commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Harding was a lean man with silver hair and the kind of stare that made junior officers check their uniforms twice. He gestured for her to sit, then leaned back in his chair, studying her. Captain Cade, I've been reviewing your file. Marin waited. You've been flying A-10s for 8 years. You've logged over 2,000 hours. You've flown combat missions in 3 different theaters, and yet somehow you've managed to stay under the radar. Why is that? Marin considered the question. I don't fly for recognition, sir. I fly because it's what I'm good at. Harding nodded slowly. That much is clear, but the Air Force needs more than just good pilots, Captain. It needs leaders, people who can inspire others, people who can make the hard calls when everything's on the line. He slid a folder across the desk. I'm recommending you for upgrade to instructor pilot, and I'm putting you in for a medal. Probably the Distinguished Flying Cross, maybe higher. The paperwork's already moving. Marin stared at the folder, then at Harding. "Sir, You earned it, Captain. Don't argue with me." She closed her mouth, nodded. "Yes, sir." Harding's expression softened slightly. "You did something out there that most pilots couldn't have done. You held the line when no one else could. That's not luck. That's not just skill. That's character. And the Air Force needs more of that." He stood, and Marin stood with him. "Dismissed and Cade." "Sir." "Welcome to the team, for real this time." Months later, when the valley was just a memory and the Warthog had been patched and returned to the line, Marin found herself flying over the same stretch of mountains where Ray's had gone down. It was a clear day, the sky a perfect blue, the terrain below softened by distance and light. She thought about that day, the fear, the focus, the moment when the engine died and she'd had to trust that the plane would hold together long enough to reach the runway. She thought about Ray's voice on the radio, tight with pain and hope. She thought about the ground crew's faces when she climbed out of the cockpit, their disbelief mixing with respect. She thought about the patch on her flight suit, the one Ray's had given her, the one that said she belonged. And she realized that she'd spent so much of her career trying to prove that she was good enough, competent enough, worthy enough. She'd flown missions and logged hours and kept her head down, believing that the work would speak for itself. But the truth was, sometimes the work needed a voice. Sometimes you had to let people see you, not just the aircraft you flew or the missions you completed. You had to let them see the person behind the call sign, the one who made the hard choices and carried the weight and kept flying even when every instinct screamed to turn back. She keyed the radio, her voice steady. "Bagram Actual Hog 23, checking in on station." The controller's response was immediate, familiar. "Copy Hog 23, good to have you up there." Marin smiled just slightly and banked the Warthog south, the mountains falling away beneath her, the horizon opening up wide and endless. "Good to be here," she said. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The years rolled on, and Marin Cade became a name that new pilots learned in their initial briefings. She became an instructor, teaching the next generation how to fly the Warthog, how to think under pressure, how to make the impossible look routine. She taught them about fuel management and weapons employment and how to read terrain like a book. But more than that, she taught them about resilience, about pushing through fear and doubt and the voice that said you couldn't do it. She told them about the valley, not to brag but to illustrate a point, that the mission mattered more than the fear, that the man on the ground mattered more than the fuel gauge, that sometimes you had to trust the plane, trust yourself, and trust that the math would work out even when the numbers said it wouldn't. Her students listened, wide-eyed and silent, and when she finished, they asked questions, not about the tactics or the techniques, but about what it felt like. What it felt like to fly a dead aircraft onto a runway. What it felt like to know you'd saved a life. Marin answered honestly. It felt like terror and relief and exhaustion all at once. It felt like the best and worst moment of her life. It felt like everything she'd trained for had distilled down into a single choice, and she'd made the right one. But she always added, "I didn't do it alone. The Warthog did half the work, and the people on the ground did the other half. I just held the stick." It was a lie, and they all knew it. But it was the kind of lie that made them believe they could do it too. One evening, years after the valley, Marin stood on the flight line at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and gold. The Warthogs sat in their revetments, silent and still, their noses pointed skyward like sentinels waiting for the call. She'd flown her last mission 2 weeks ago, her retirement papers signed and filed, her locker cleaned out. She was done. But standing there, watching the light fade, she didn't feel finished. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something, a new chapter that she hadn't written yet. A voice called out behind her. "Captain Cade." She turned. A young pilot, fresh out of training, stood a few feet away, her flight suit crisp and new, her eyes uncertain. "I just wanted to say, I've heard the stories, about the valley, about what you did, and I wanted you to know that you're the reason I wanted to fly the A-10. Marin studied the young woman, seeing something of herself in the nervous energy, the quiet determination. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Sarah Marquez, ma'am." Marin smiled. "Don't call me ma'am. I'm retired now, just Marin." Marquez nodded, still a little stiff. "Marin, then, I wanted to thank you for showing us that it's possible to be good at this, to matter." Marin reached out, put a hand on Marquez's shoulder. "You already matter, Lieutenant. You mattered the day you earned your wings. Now you just have to believe it." Marquez nodded, her eyes bright, and Marin could see the moment it clicked. The moment the doubt gave way to something stronger. "Yes, yes, thank you." She saluted and Marin returned it, sharp and precise. Then Marquez turned and walked back toward the ready room, her stride a little more confident now. Marin watched her go, then turned back to the flight line. The warthogs were still there, waiting, always waiting. She thought about the valley one last time, about the fear and the fuel and the moment when she'd thought she might not make it, about the choice she'd made to stay, to fight, to believe that she could do the impossible. She'd made the right choice. And now, watching the next generation take their place in the cockpit, she knew that the choice would outlive her, that the story would be told again and again, passed down from instructor to student, from pilot to pilot, a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was flying anyway. Marin Cade's story didn't end with her retirement. It lived on in the briefing rooms and ready rooms, in the quiet conversations between pilots before a mission, in the lessons taught to wide-eyed students who dreamed of flying the Warthog. It lived on in the patch that Jonah Reyes had given her, the one that now hung framed in the squadron's heritage room, a reminder of what one pilot could do when everything was on the line. And it lived on in the sky, in every A-10 that took off and headed into harm's way, carrying pilots who'd heard the story and believed that they, too, could hold the line when no one else could. The valley was just one mission, just one day, but it became more than that. It became a symbol, a standard, a promise that no matter how bad things got, no matter how low the fuel or how high the stakes, there would always be someone willing to stay, someone willing to fight, someone willing to bring the lost home. And that someone on that day had been Marin Cade. Years later, when the Air Force dedicated a new training program for close air support pilots, they named it after her, the Cade Initiative, a program focused on resilience, decision-making under pressure, and the kind of flying that couldn't be taught from a manual. The kind that came from experience, from instinct, from the place inside a pilot where fear and courage met and fought, and sometimes courage won. The commandant of the program, a colonel who'd flown with Marin in the early days, stood at the podium during the dedication ceremony and told the story of the valley. He told it the way it had been told to him, with the details sharp and vivid, with the stakes clear and unforgiving. He told it like a documentary, like something that had already passed into legend. And when he finished, he looked out at the rows of students, their faces rapt, their eyes bright. "That," he said, "is what it means to be a Warthog pilot. That is what we're here to teach you, not just how to fly the plane, but how to be the kind of pilot who flies it when everything says you can't." The students nodded, their hands already itching for the stick. And somewhere, watching from the back of the room, Marin Cade smiled. On quiet nights, when the base was dark and the flight line was empty, Marin would sometimes walk out to the revetments and stand beside the Warthogs. She'd run her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets and seams, the cold metal solid and real under her palm. She'd think about all the missions she'd flown, all the close calls and near misses, all the times she'd brought the plane home with nothing but skill and nerve and the stubborn refusal to quit. And she'd think about the valley. It had been the defining moment of her career, the mission that changed everything. But it hadn't been the only moment. There had been hundreds of others, smaller and quieter, where she'd made the choice to stay, to fight, to fly when it would have been easier to walk away. Those moments mattered too, maybe even more because they'd built the foundation that made the valley possible. They taught her that courage wasn't a single act. It was a habit, a discipline, a choice you made every day, every mission, every time you strapped into the cockpit and pointed the nose toward the unknown. Standing there in the dark, Marin felt a deep sense of peace. She'd done the work. She'd flown the missions. She'd held the line. And now, in her own quiet way, she was passing it on. The warthog beside her sat silent, its engines cold, its weapons bay empty. But it wasn't retired. It was resting, waiting for the next pilot, the next mission, the next moment when someone would need it to do the impossible. And it would be ready, just like Marin had been, just like the pilots who came after her would be. Because that was the promise of the A-10, that no matter what, no matter the odds, it would stay, it would fight, it would bring them home. And that promise, more than anything, was what Marin Cade had proven in the valley. That when the call came, when the mission demanded everything, there would always be someone willing to answer. Someone willing to fly low, stay long, and never quit. Someone like her. Decades passed, and the Warthog itself became a legend. The Air Force tried to retire it more than once, but the pilots and the ground troops wouldn't let it go. They knew what the plane could do. They knew what it meant to have that roar overhead, that cannon spitting fire, that stubborn airframe refusing to quit even when every system was screaming failure. And when they talked about the Warthog, they talked about Marin Cade. Her story was taught in flight school. It was written into training manuals. It was told around tables in officers' clubs and mess halls, the details growing sharper with each retelling, the legend solidifying into something permanent. But the core of the story never changed. A pilot, a valley, a choice. And the refusal to leave a man behind. That was the part that mattered, not the fuel state or the gun runs or the dead stick landing. Those were just details. The heart of the story was simpler, deeper, older than aviation itself. Someone had needed help, and Marin Cade had answered. That was the promise she'd made when she earned her wings. That was the promise every pilot made. But not every pilot had to keep it the way she had, in the crucible of fire and fear and impossible odds. And because she had, because she'd stayed when logic said to go, because she'd trusted herself and the plane and the mission more than the numbers on the gauge, she'd proven something essential. That the impossible was just a word, that limits were suggestions, that the only thing that mattered in the end was whether you had the courage to try. And Marin Cade had courage in abundance. The last time Marin flew an A-10, she was 73 years old. It was an exhibition flight at an air show, a demonstration for a crowd that had gathered to see the legendary Warthog in action. The Air Force had restored one of the original airframes, the same type she'd flown in the valley, and they'd asked her to take it up. She'd hesitated. It had been years since she'd been in the cockpit. Her hands weren't as steady, her eyes weren't as sharp. But when she climbed into the seat and wrapped her fingers around the stick, it all came back. The muscle memory, the instinct, the feel of the plane responding to her touch like an old friend. She taxied out to the runway, the crowd watching, the announcer's voice booming over the loudspeakers, telling her story. She didn't listen. She was already somewhere else, already in that space between earth and sky where nothing mattered but the plane and the air and the horizon. She pushed the throttles forward, and the Warthog roared to life. The takeoff was smooth, the climb steady. She leveled off at 5,000 feet and banked over the airfield, the crowd below a blur of faces and flags. She flew a series of passes, low and fast, the cannon making simulated runs, the engines roaring in that familiar guttural thunder. And for a few minutes, she was 30 years younger. She was back in the valley, back in the fight, back in the moment when everything hung in the balance and the only thing that mattered was holding the line. The landing was gentle, almost reverent. She taxied back to the ramp, shut down the engines, and popped the canopy. The crowd erupted in applause, but she barely heard it. She was still in the cockpit, still feeling the ghost of the mission in her hands. A young pilot met her on the tarmac, eyes wide. "Ma'am, that was incredible." Marin climbed down slowly, her legs stiff, her body reminding her that she wasn't young anymore. "It's not the pilot," she said quietly. "It's the plane." The young pilot shook her head. "No, ma'am, it's both." Marin smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself accept the truth of it. It was both. Marin Cade passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 81. There was no drama, no final battle, just a peaceful end to a life lived with courage and purpose. The funeral was held at Arlington, the service attended by hundreds of pilots, ground crew, and the men and women whose lives she'd touched over the decades. Jonah Reyes was there, his hair gray now, his limp barely noticeable. He stood at the front, his hand resting on the flag-draped coffin, and spoke about the day in the valley, about the fear and the fire and the voice on the radio that had promised him he wouldn't die alone. "She saved my life," he said, his voice steady. "But more than that, she showed me what it meant to be a pilot, to put the mission above yourself, to trust the plane and trust your training and trust that you can do the impossible if you just refuse to quit." He paused, his eyes bright. "Marin Cade was the best pilot I ever knew, and I'm not the only one who owes her everything." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Ray stepped back, saluting the coffin. 4 A-10s flew overhead in missing man formation, the slot empty, the roar of the engines echoing across the cemetery. And in that moment, everyone there understood. The slot would always be empty, because there would never be another Marin Cade. But the legacy would remain. The story would be told. And every pilot who strapped into a warthog would carry a piece of her with them, a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was flying anyway. Years later, a young pilot named Lieutenant Marquez stood in the Cade Initiative briefing room, staring at the framed patch on the wall. The same patch Jonah Reyes had given Marin all those years ago. She'd heard the story 100 times, but it never got old. She thought about her own missions, the close calls and the hard choices. She thought about the moments when she doubted herself, when the fuel gauge had dropped too low or the threat warning had screamed too loud. And she thought about Marin Cade, the pilot who'd held the line when no one else could. Marquez turned to the instructor beside her. "Do you think we can live up to that?" The instructor, a grizzled major with 20 years in the cockpit, smiled. "We don't have to live up to it. We just have to remember it. Remember that someone did it once, which means it's possible. And if it's possible, we can do it too." Marquez nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the words settle into her chest. "Then let's make sure we do." The instructor clapped her on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, Lieutenant. Now let's get you airborne." They walked out to the flight line together, the sun rising over the desert, the warthogs waiting in their revetments. And as Marquez climbed into the cockpit, she felt something shift inside her. A connection to the past, to the pilots who'd come before, to the woman whose name was painted on the side of the building. She strapped in, ran through the checks, and taxied out to the runway. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and she pushed the throttles forward. The warthog roared, and Lieutenant Marquez lifted off into the sky, carrying the legacy of Marin Cade with her.